Sometimes the richest lessons in life don't come from those who have the most money, but from those who have the most heart. There are moments when one simple act changes everything you thought you knew about the world. On a dusty road near a small town stands a man in overalls. His name is Thomas. He has a small workshop and hands dirty from work. When an expensive car stops and a wealthy man asks for help, Thomas doesn't make him wait even a minute. He fixes the engine quickly and well. The rich man Victor pulls out money. He offers a large tip. Thomas just shakes his head. No, thank you. Help is not about money. Victor doesn't understand. He leaves angry. How dare this simple mechanic? But life has its plan. In a few days, they will meet again. And this time, the truth will show who is truly rich and what it means to be a good person. Can one small choice change two lives forever? The morning sun rose slowly over the town of Lipova, casting long shadows across the quiet streets where modest homes stood side by side with small family businesses. This was a place where everyone knew everyone, where a handshake still meant something, and where a man's word was his bond. The air smelled of fresh bread from the bakery on Main Street, and motor oil from the workshops that lined the industrial edge of town. It was the kind of place that time seemed to have forgotten, where life moved at a gentler pace, and people still stopped to help a neighbor without expecting anything in return. Thomas Novak had lived in Lipova his entire life, all 53 years of it. He was born in the small house behind his workshop, the same house where his father had raised him and taught him everything he knew about engines, about honesty, and about what it meant to be a man of principle. His father, Joseph, had been a mechanic too, one of the best in the region, known not just for his skill with tools, but for his integrity. Joseph had always told young Thomas that there were two ways to live in this world. You could chase money and never have enough, or you could chase meaning and always feel rich. Those words had shaped Thomas in ways he only fully understood as he grew older. The workshop itself was nothing fancy. It was a simple building with corrugated metal walls, a concrete floor stained with decades of oil and grease, and tools that hung on pegboards like old friends. Some of those tools had belonged to his father, and Thomas used them with the same care and respect that Joseph had shown. There was a comfort in the familiar weight of a wrench in his hand, in the smell of gasoline and metal, in the sound of an engine coming back to life under his careful attention. This was his world, small and humble, but it was honest work, and it was his. Thomas had never married, though there had been someone once, many years ago. Her name was Helena, and she had been the light of his young life. They had planned to build a future together, to fill that little house behind the workshop with children and laughter. But life had other plans. Helena had gotten sick, one of those cruel illnesses that takes the young and beautiful and leaves everyone asking why. She had died in the spring, when everything else was coming back to life, and something in Thomas had died with her. He had never looked at another woman the same way after that. He poured his grief into his work, into helping others, into being the kind of man Helena would have been proud of. The town knew his story, though Thomas never spoke of it. They saw it in the way he lived, in the quiet dignity with which he faced each day. He opened his workshop every morning at 7, worked until 6 in the evening, and charged fair prices that barely covered his expenses. When someone couldn't afford to pay, he would wave them off with a smile and tell them to pay when they could. Some never did, and Thomas never chased them for it. Money was just money, he would say. People were what mattered. His best friend was a man named Pavel, who ran the small grocery store 2 streets over. Pavel was round and jovial, the opposite of Thomas's quiet, lean presence. They had grown up together, had gotten into trouble together as boys, and had supported each other through all of life's ups and downs. Every evening after work, they would sit on the bench outside Pavel's store and watch the town settle into night. They would talk about everything and nothing, about the old days and the changing world, about their aches and pains and small victories. It was a friendship built on decades of shared history, and it was one of the things that kept Thomas grounded. Pavel worried about Thomas sometimes. He thought his friend worked too hard for too little, that he was too generous with people who took advantage of his kindness. But Thomas would just smile and shake his head. "I sleep well at night," he would say. "Can everyone say the same?" And that would be the end of it, because Pavel knew that once Thomas had made up his mind about something, there was no changing it. The man had principles that ran deeper than any argument could reach. The town of Lipova had been changing slowly over the years. Young people were leaving for the cities, chasing opportunities that didn't exist in small towns anymore. The old businesses were struggling, unable to compete with the big stores and online shopping that had invaded even this quiet corner of the world. But there were also new people arriving, wealthy folks from the city, who had discovered the countryside and wanted to build their vacation homes in the hills surrounding the town. They brought money, but not always respect for the way things had always been done. They wanted things fast and convenient, and they didn't understand why the local mechanic might close his shop on Sunday, or why the baker didn't make fancy pastries with foreign names. Thomas had worked on some of their cars, these city people with their expensive vehicles and impatient attitudes. He treated them the same as everyone else, with courtesy and honest work. But he noticed the way they looked at his simple workshop, the way they checked their watches as if his time was somehow less valuable than theirs. He never said anything, just did his work and sent them on their way. Some left generous tips, which he quietly donated to the church fund for families in need. Some barely thanked him at all. It was all the same to Thomas. He wasn't doing it for gratitude or recognition. He was doing it because it was right. There was a young boy in town named Martin, maybe 12 years old, who had started hanging around the workshop after school. His father had left when he was small, and his mother worked 2 jobs to keep them fed. The boy was curious about engines, would watch Thomas work with wide eyes and ask 100 questions. Thomas never minded. He would explain what he was doing, let the boy hand him tools, teach him the names of parts and how they worked together. It reminded him of learning from his own father, of how knowledge and skill were passed down, not through books, but through patient hands and willing hearts. He never thought of it as charity or even as teaching. It was just what you did. You helped the next generation find their way, just as someone had helped you. The workshop had an old radio that played throughout the day, usually tuned to a station that played music from decades past. Songs that Thomas remembered from his youth, melodies that carried memories of Helena and his father, and times that seemed simpler in retrospect. Sometimes he would catch himself humming along as he worked, his hands moving with practiced efficiency, while his mind wandered through the years. He had made peace with his life, with its joys and sorrows, with what he had and what he had lost. He was content in a way that he knew many people never achieved, even those with far more wealth and status than he would ever possess. On the day that Victor Stern's car broke down on the road outside Lipova, Thomas had been working on an old truck that belonged to a farmer from the next valley. The truck was nearly as old as Thomas himself, held together more by stubbornness than engineering at this point. But the farmer loved it, and Thomas was determined to keep it running. He was elbow-deep in the engine compartment when he heard the sound of an expensive car pulling up outside, its engine making a sound that told him immediately what the problem was. He wiped his hands on his rag, the same oil-stained cloth he had used for years, and walked out to see who needed help. The car was a luxury sedan, black and gleaming even with the dust from the country road dulling its shine. It was the kind of car that cost more than Thomas would earn in 5 years, maybe 10. And standing beside it, looking annoyed and impatient, was a man in a suit that probably cost more than the car repairs would. He was talking loudly on his phone, gesturing with his free hand, clearly angry about the inconvenience of his vehicle failing him in the middle of nowhere. This was Victor Stern, though Thomas didn't know his name yet. He just saw a man who needed help, same as anyone else who had ever pulled up to his workshop. So he approached with his usual quiet courtesy and asked what the problem was. Victor barely glanced at him, continuing his phone conversation for another minute before finally acknowledging the mechanic's presence. The car had lost power, was making a terrible noise, and he needed it fixed immediately. He had an important meeting in the city in 3 hours. Could this place handle such a vehicle, or should he call for a tow truck to take it somewhere more professional? Thomas didn't react to the implied insult. He had heard worse over the years, and it never bothered him. He simply asked to look at the engine, and Victor, after a moment of hesitation, handed him the keys as if he was doing Thomas a great favor. The problem was actually quite simple once Thomas opened the hood. A belt had snapped, a common enough issue, but one that needed to be fixed before the car could go anywhere. He had the part in stock, surprisingly, because he kept a wide variety of supplies for exactly these situations. He told Victor it would take about an hour to fix properly, and the man's face darkened with frustration. An hour? He didn't have an hour to waste in this forgotten little town. Thomas simply nodded and said he could do it in 45 minutes if he focused solely on this job, but it would be 45 minutes regardless. That was how long it took to do it right, and doing it right was the only way Thomas knew how to work. Victor Stern paced back and forth outside the workshop while Thomas worked, making phone call after phone call, his voice carrying across the quiet street. Thomas could hear him rescheduling meetings, barking orders at assistants, complaining about the incompetence of his driver for not checking the vehicle before this trip. The man's world seemed to revolve around deadlines and deals, around millions of dollars and power moves that meant nothing to the people of Lipova. Thomas worked steadily, his hands sure and practiced as he removed the broken belt and fitted the new one into place. He checked the tension carefully, made sure everything was aligned properly, then tested the engine to ensure it ran smoothly. It was good work, the kind his father would have approved of, and Thomas felt the quiet satisfaction that came from a job done right. When he finally emerged from under the hood, his hands freshly wiped on that old rag, Victor was finishing yet another call. The man looked at him with barely concealed impatience and asked if it was done. Thomas nodded and said the car would run fine now, that the belt had been the only problem and everything else looked good. Victor didn't thank him, just asked how much he owed. Thomas calculated the cost in his head, the price of the part plus a fair amount for his labor, and named a figure that was less than what any city mechanic would have charged. Victor pulled out his wallet without comment, extracted several bills that added up to 3 times what Thomas had asked for, and held them out. "Keep the change," he said dismissively, as if this generous tip somehow demonstrated his superiority. This was the moment that would change everything, though neither man knew it yet. Thomas looked at the money in Victor's hand, then up at the man's face, and saw something there that troubled him. It wasn't just arrogance or impatience. It was a kind of emptiness, a belief that everything and everyone could be bought, that money was the answer to all problems and the measure of all worth. And in that moment, Thomas made a decision that came from the deepest part of who he was. He reached out and took only the exact amount he had named, folding the bills carefully and putting them in his pocket. Then he gently pushed Victor's hand with the remaining money back toward him. "I only charge what the work is worth," he said quietly. "You don't owe me anything more than that." Victor stared at him as if he had spoken in a foreign language. "What?" The man's confusion was genuine. Nobody refused his money. Nobody turned down a tip that generous. "Are you saying my money isn't good enough for you?" Thomas shook his head patiently. "Your money is fine. But I didn't help you for a tip. I helped you because your car was broken, and I could fix it. That's what I do. That's all there is to it." The words hung in the air between them, simple and profound. Victor's face went through several expressions, confusion giving way to disbelief, and then to something like anger. He wasn't used to being refused, wasn't used to someone not jumping at the chance to take his money. In his world, everything was a transaction, everything had a price, and generosity was just another form of power. This simple mechanic in his dirty overalls had just rejected that entire worldview, and Victor didn't know how to process it. "You're making a mistake," Victor said, his voice cold now. "Do you know who I am? I'm offering you more money than you probably make in a week, and you're too proud to take it." Thomas met his eyes calmly. "I don't know who you are, and it doesn't matter. I'm not too proud. I just don't need more than what's fair. You got your car fixed, I got paid for my work. That's a good trade for both of us." Victor opened his mouth to argue further, then seemed to think better of it. He stuffed the remaining money back in his wallet with sharp, angry movements. "You people in these small towns, you think you're so noble, so pure. You don't understand how the real world works." Thomas almost smiled at that, but he kept his expression neutral. "Maybe not, but I understand how to sleep well at night." And with that, he turned and walked back into his workshop, leaving Victor standing beside his repaired car, furious and confused in equal measure. The wealthy man got into his vehicle, started the engine which now purred perfectly, and drove away with a spray of gravel and dust. He didn't look back. Thomas watched him go from the doorway of the workshop, then returned to the farmer's old truck that still needed his attention. He thought the incident was over, just another brief encounter with someone from a different world who would return to that world and forget all about the mechanic in Lipova. But the interaction had planted something in both men, seeds that would grow in unexpected ways. For Thomas, it was a moment of clarity about why he lived the way he did, a reminder that his father's teachings about meaning over money were not just old-fashioned ideas, but truths that sustained him. For Victor, though he would not have admitted it, it was the first crack in the armor of certainty he had built around himself. The first time in years that someone had looked at him and seen not his wealth or power, but simply a man, and had found him somehow lacking. Pavel stopped by the workshop later that afternoon, as he often did when business was slow at his store. He found Thomas back at work on the farmer's truck, and settled onto an old stool to watch and chat. After a few minutes of comfortable silence, he mentioned that he had seen the fancy car outside earlier, had watched it drive away in quite a hurry. Everything okay? Thomas wiped his hands and told Pavel the story, keeping it brief and factual. Pavel listened with growing amazement, and then laughed, a big booming sound that filled the workshop. You refused a tip from a rich man? My friend, you are either the most principled person I know, or the craziest. Maybe both. Thomas shrugged. It didn't feel right. He was trying to buy something that wasn't for sale. Pavel shook his head, still smiling, but with a hint of concern in his eyes. You know, one of these days your principles are going to get you in trouble. Not everyone appreciates being told their money is no good. Maybe, Thomas agreed. But I would rather have trouble than compromise who I am. And that, Pavel knew, was the absolute truth. His friend would starve before he would violate his own sense of what was right. It was admirable and frustrating in equal measure, and it was exactly why Pavel valued their friendship so deeply. In a world where everyone seemed willing to bend their beliefs for convenience or profit, Thomas stood firm, a rock in a river of change. The rest of the day passed normally. Thomas finished the farmer's truck and called him to come pick it up. He worked on 2 other vehicles, both simple repairs that took less than an hour each. He swept the workshop floor, organized his tools, and locked up at his usual time. He walked home to his little house, heated up leftover soup for dinner, and sat on his porch as the sun set over Lipova. It was a good day, unremarkable in most ways, just another day of honest work and simple living. He had no way of knowing that his refusal of Victor Stern's money had set events in motion that would soon return to his doorstep in ways he could never have imagined. Because Victor Stern was not a man who forgot slights, real or perceived, and he was not a man who left things unfinished. As he drove back to the city that afternoon, his anger slowly cooled into something more calculating. That mechanic had embarrassed him, had made him feel small in a way that no one had dared to do in years. Who did he think he was, refusing money like some kind of saint? Victor had built an empire through ruthlessness and determination, had climbed from nothing to everything through sheer force of will, and he was not about to let some small-town nobody make him look foolish. By the time he reached his office building, a glass and steel tower that dominated the city skyline, he had made a decision. He would find out everything about this Thomas Novak, and then he would teach him a lesson about refusing the generosity of Victor Stern. He had resources, connections, ways of making life difficult for people who crossed him. It would be easy to cause problems for a small workshop in a forgotten town. A few phone calls, some strategic complaints to regulatory agencies, maybe some competition moved into the area. He had done worse to bigger obstacles. But something made him pause. As he sat in his executive chair, looking out over the city he had conquered, he found himself thinking about the mechanic's face, about the calm certainty in his eyes when he had refused the money. The man had not been afraid of him, had not been impressed by him, had simply seen him as another customer, no more and no less important than anyone else. And that, Victor realized with uncomfortable clarity, was what really bothered him. Not the refused money itself, but what it represented. For just a moment, he wondered what it would be like to be that certain of yourself, to need so little, to be content with such a simple life. Then he pushed the thought away and reached for his phone. He would deal with this mechanic later when he had time. Right now he had meetings and deals and a dozen crises that needed his attention. But he did not forget. Victor Stern never forgot. 3 days passed in Lipova with the comfortable rhythm that Thomas had known all his life. He woke each morning before sunrise, made his simple breakfast of bread and coffee, and walked to the workshop as the town slowly came to life around him. The incident with the wealthy man from the city had already begun to fade from his mind, just another brief encounter in a life full of them. He had no reason to think he would ever see Victor Stern again, or that their paths would cross in any meaningful way. The workshop stayed busy with the usual flow of work. Old cars that needed coaxing back to health, farm equipment that had to last another season, the occasional motorcycle or truck. Thomas treated each job with the same careful attention, whether it was a simple oil change or a complex engine rebuild. Young Martin continued to stop by after school, his curiosity about mechanics growing stronger each day. Thomas found himself looking forward to the boy's visits, to the eager questions, and the way Martin's face would light up when he finally understood how something worked. It reminded Thomas that knowledge was meant to be shared, that skills passed from one generation to the next were a kind of immortality. On the 4th day after Victor's visit, something unusual happened. A woman came to the workshop driving a modest sedan that was making a concerning noise from the front end. Thomas recognized her as someone who lived on the outskirts of town, a widow named Anna who cleaned houses for some of the wealthier families in the area. She was probably in her 60s, thin and worn down by years of hard work and harder circumstances. She apologized for bothering him, said she knew he was busy, but the car was making this terrible sound, and she was afraid to drive it much further. Thomas assured her it was no bother, and asked her to describe when the noise happened. She explained it had started just that morning on her way back from a cleaning job at one of the big houses in the hills. Thomas took the car for a short test drive and immediately identified the problem. The bearing in the front wheel was failing, a serious issue that could not be ignored. If it gave out completely while she was driving, the wheel could lock up or even come off, causing an accident. It needed to be fixed right away. He brought the car back and gave Anna the news as gently as he could. She listened with growing worry, already calculating costs she could not afford. How much would it be to fix? Thomas named a price that was as low as he could make it, barely covering the cost of parts and a fraction of his labor. Anna's face fell. She did not have that much. Not right now. Maybe in a few weeks when she got paid for all her jobs, but not today. Could she still drive it for a little while, just until she could save up the money? Thomas shook his head. It's not safe. That bearing could fail at any moment. I can't let you drive it like this. Anna's eyes filled with tears she tried to hide. But I need the car for work. I have jobs scheduled, families depending on me. If I can't drive, I can't work. If I can't work, I can't pay for the repair. It's impossible. And there it was, the impossible situation that Thomas had seen so many times before. Good people trapped by circumstances beyond their control, trying to survive in a world that did not make it easy. He looked at Anna's worn face, at the pride and fear warring in her eyes, and he made the same choice he had made dozens of times before. I'll fix it today, he told her. You can pay me when you have the money. There's no rush. Anna protested, said she could not accept charity, that she would find another way. But Thomas was firm. It's not charity. It's just business on a payment plan. You'll pay me when you can. Until then, you need a safe car to work. That's all there is to it." She finally agreed, tears of relief now, and thanked him over and over. Thomas waved off her gratitude and got to work immediately. By late afternoon, the car was fixed and running smoothly. Anna came to pick it up, still emotional and grateful. She promised she would pay him back as soon as possible, every penny. Thomas knew she would try, knew she was the kind of person who honored her debts. He also knew it might take months, and that was fine. Some things were more important than money. What Thomas did not know was that Anna cleaned house for a family named the Dvoraks, and that the Dvoraks were friends with Victor Stern. It was a connection so small and unlikely that no one could have predicted it would matter. But sometimes the threads that bind our lives together are invisible until they are pulled tight. That evening, as Thomas and Pavel sat on their usual bench watching the sunset, Pavel brought up something that had been bothering him. "Have you noticed more of those city people around lately? Coming through town, buying up land in the hills?" Thomas had noticed. It was hard to miss the construction vehicles and the new houses going up where there had only been forest and fields before. "I've seen it." "What about it?" Pavel frowned. "I don't know. It just feels like things are changing, not necessarily for the better. My cousin, who lives up in the hills, said one of these developers tried to buy his land, offered him a lot of money. When he said no, they started making trouble. Complaints about his fence line, his dogs, his firewood pile. Little things, but constant." Thomas was quiet for a moment. Some people think everything is for sale. They don't know what to do when they meet something that isn't. That's their problem, not ours. "Maybe," Pavel said. "But their problems have a way of becoming our problems. You remember what happened to old Yosef's farm? The developers wanted his land. He wouldn't sell. And suddenly he had all kinds of regulatory issues, health inspectors, environmental concerns, things that had never been a problem before. They made his life so difficult, he finally gave up and sold." Thomas remembered. It had angered him at the time, the way a good man had been harassed into giving up land that had been in his family for generations. But what could one person do against people with money and lawyers and connections? You can't fight City Hall, as the saying went. You certainly could not fight developers with deep pockets and no conscience. "I try not to borrow trouble," Thomas said finally. "If it comes, I'll deal with it. Until then, I'll just keep doing what I do. That's all any of us can do." Pavel nodded, but he still looked worried. His friend's stubborn integrity was admirable, but it also made him vulnerable. In a world that ran on compromise and deals, a man who refused to bend was at risk of breaking. But he knew better than to push the point. Thomas would live according to his principles, no matter, Saul, what anyone said. The next morning brought another surprise. A man Thomas had never seen before came to the workshop driving a truck with city plates. He was young, maybe 30, dressed in casual clothes that still somehow screamed money. He had the confidence of someone used to getting what he wanted. He introduced himself as Marek and said he was looking to open a car repair business in the area. He had heard Thomas was the local mechanic and wanted to talk shop, maybe pick up some tips about the local market. Thomas was friendly but cautious. It was unusual for someone from the city to want to open a business in Lipova. The town was small and getting smaller. There was not enough work for one mechanic most of the time, let alone two. "Why here?" he asked. "Why not stay in the city where there are more customers?" Marek smiled. I like small towns. Less stress, better quality of life. And I think there's opportunity here with all the new development going on. Those folks building houses in the hills, they have nice cars that need service. There's money to be made if you know how to position yourself. Thomas did not like the way Marek talked about people as markets and opportunities, but he kept his thoughts to himself and answered the man's questions politely. Yes, he was the only full-time mechanic in town. No, he did not do much advertising. Yes, most of his business came from word of mouth and repeat customers. Marek nodded thoughtfully at each answer, and Thomas had the uncomfortable feeling he was being assessed in some way. After about 20 minutes, Marek thanked him for his time and left. The whole conversation felt strange to Thomas, but he pushed it from his mind and returned to work. He had a list of jobs to complete and no time for puzzles. But that night, lying in bed in his small house, he found himself thinking about Pavel's warnings and Marek's visit and the changes happening all around him. The world was shifting in ways he did not fully understand, and for the first time in many years, Thomas felt a small whisper of unease about the future. 2 weeks went by, and Thomas found himself busier than usual. Several of the new residents from the hills brought their cars to him, expensive vehicles that needed maintenance and repairs. At first he was pleased by the extra work, but something about these customers bothered him. They were impatient and demanding, treating him more like a servant than a skilled tradesman. They questioned his prices even though they were lower than anywhere in the city, complained about wait times even though he worked as fast as anyone could, and seemed perpetually dissatisfied even when the work was perfect. One of them, a man named Robert, who had built a massive house overlooking the valley, was particularly difficult. He brought his luxury vehicle in for a routine service and stood over Thomas the entire time, asking constant questions and making suggestions about how to do the job faster. Thomas bore it patiently, but Robert's presence made the work harder and slower, which only made the man more irritated. When Thomas finished and presented the bill, Robert looked at it with barely concealed contempt. "This much for an oil change and filter. You're taking advantage because I'm from the city. That's not right." Thomas felt his patience wearing thin, but kept his voice level. "That's the standard rate. Same as I charge everyone. You can check with anyone in town." Robert pulled out his phone and made a show of looking up prices online. "See, I can get this done for half the price at the chain place 30 kilometers from here." Thomas nodded calmly. "Then you should go there next time. But you came here because your car needed service now, and that's the closest chain shop. My price includes the convenience of being local and the quality of personal service. That's worth something." Robert paid, but made it clear he thought he was being robbed. As he drove away, Thomas felt tired in a way that had nothing to do with physical work. These new people brought money to the area, but they also brought an attitude that everything should bend to their will, that everyone should be grateful for their business and willing to negotiate every price and principle. It was exhausting in a way that honest poverty never was. Young Martin noticed Thomas's mood when he stopped by after school. "You seem sad today," the boy said with the directness of youth. Thomas managed a smile. "Just a long day. Some customers are harder to please than others." Martin nodded wisely. "My mum says some people are never happy no matter what you do for them. She says it's because they're unhappy inside and they take it out on everyone else." "Your mother is a smart woman," Thomas said. "That's exactly right." They worked together in comfortable silence for a while, Thomas showing Martin how to check brake pads and explaining why regular maintenance prevented bigger problems. The boy's enthusiasm helped lift Thomas's spirits. This was why he did what he did, not for difficult customers or money, but for moments like this, where he could pass on knowledge and help someone learn. When Martin's mother came to pick him up, she thanked Thomas, as she always did, for spending time with her son. Thomas waved off her thanks. "He's a good boy and a quick learner. You should be proud." She smiled, but there was worry in her eyes. "I heard there might be another mechanic opening a shop in town. Is that true?" Thomas had heard the same rumor. Marek, the young man who had visited weeks ago, had apparently leased a building on the other side of town and was fitting it out as a modern repair facility. Word was he had expensive equipment and planned to offer cut-rate prices to attract customers. "I've heard that," Thomas confirmed. "Competition is normal. There's room for everyone." "But is there?" she asked gently. "Lipova isn't that big. If he takes half your customers, can you survive?" Thomas had been asking himself the same question, but he would not burden her with his worries. "I've been doing this for 30 years. I'll be fine. Things have a way of working out." She did not look convinced, but she did not push further. As she drove away with Martin waving from the passenger window, Thomas stood in the doorway of his workshop and wondered if he had been lying to her or to himself. The truth was that his margins were already thin. He charged fair prices that barely covered expenses because that was what people could afford. If a flashy new competitor came in and undercut his rates, even temporarily, he might lose enough business to make things very difficult. And he was not getting any younger. His back hurt more than it used to. His hands were starting to show signs of arthritis, and there were some repairs that took him longer now than they once had. Pavel found him still standing there an hour later, staring at nothing. Without a word, his friend produced 2 beers from a cooled bag and handed one to Thomas. They sat on the bench outside the workshop and drank in silence for a few minutes. Finally, Pavel spoke. "You've heard about Marek's new shop?" It was not a question. Thomas nodded. "I've heard." "Are you worried?" "Should I be?" Pavel considered this. "Maybe. I did some asking around. Marek isn't just some young guy who wants to open a business. He's backed by investors from the city. Real money. They're setting him up with everything he needs to run you out of business." Thomas felt something cold settle in his stomach. Why would anyone invest that much just to compete with a small-town mechanic? Doesn't make financial sense. "Exactly," Pavel said. "Which means it's not about making money, at least not at first. It's about something else." Thomas thought about Victor Stern, about the anger in the man's eyes when his money had been refused. Could one refused tip really lead to all this? It seemed impossible, too petty and vindictive to believe. But Pavel was watching him with knowing eyes. "You're thinking about that rich man who stopped here a few weeks ago, the one whose money you refused." "I didn't tell you his name," Thomas said slowly. "I didn't think to ask." Pavel pulled out his phone and showed Thomas an article about local development. There was a photo of several men in suits at some kind of groundbreaking ceremony. Victor Stern was in the center, smiling for the camera. "He's one of the main investors in the hill development," Pavel explained. "Owns half the new construction up there. He's also got interests in lots of businesses, including, I found out today, the company that's backing Marek's new repair shop." Thomas stared at the photo, recognition settling over him like a heavy blanket. So this is revenge for wounded pride. Pavel shrugged. "Maybe. Or maybe it's just business to him. Either way, you've got a problem. A man with Victor Stern's resources wants to push you out. He'll find a way. They sat in silence as the sun set, both thinking about what this meant. Thomas had lived his entire life by a simple code, doing good work and treating people fairly. He had never sought wealth or power, had never tried to hurt anyone or take what was not his. And now it seemed that someone with all the money and power he had never wanted was using those things to destroy what little he had built. It was not fair, but Thomas had learned long ago that life rarely was. The question was what to do about it. He could not compete on price with someone who had deep pockets and no need to make a profit. He could not match modern equipment or flashy marketing. All he had was his reputation, his skill, and his principles. Would that be enough? "I'm not going anywhere," Thomas said finally. "This is my home. This workshop was my father's and his father's before him. I'll keep doing what I do, and trust that people will see the difference between someone who cares about the work and someone who's just here to make money." Pavel wanted to argue, to tell his friend that noble intentions would not pay the bills or compete with aggressive business tactics. But he knew Thomas well enough to know that arguing was pointless. His friend had made up his mind, and nothing would change it. He would stand on his principles, even if it cost him everything. It was admirable and foolish in equal measure, and Pavel loved him for it, even as he worried about what was coming. That night, alone in his small house, Thomas sat with a cup of tea and thought about Helena. He wondered what she would say about all this. She had always been more practical than him, more willing to compromise and adapt. But she had also believed in him, in his fundamental goodness and integrity. She would tell him to stay true to himself, he decided. She would say that some things were worth fighting for, even when the odds were bad. And she would remind him that a life lived according to your principles was its own reward, regardless of how it turned out. He went to bed feeling more settled, ready to face whatever came with the same quiet determination that had carried him through every challenge in his 53 years. But sleep was slow to come, and in the darkness he could not quite silence the voice that whispered, maybe this time it would not be enough. Maybe this time his principles would not be sufficient to protect what mattered most. Marek's new repair shop opened with great fanfare on a bright Monday morning. There were banners and balloons, promotional flyers distributed throughout town, advertising grand opening, discounts of 50% off all services. The building itself had been completely renovated, with gleaming white walls, modern equipment visible through large windows, and a waiting area that looked more like a luxury hotel lobby than a mechanic's shop. Thomas heard about it from several customers who mentioned it casually, not realizing the threat it represented. He drove by one afternoon just to see for himself and had to admit it was impressive. Everything was new and clean and efficient looking. His own workshop seemed shabby by comparison, with its old tools and oil-stained floors and handwritten receipts. But appearances were not everything, he reminded himself. Quality work spoke for itself. The first week after Marek opened, Thomas noticed a slight drop in business. A few regular customers did not show up for scheduled maintenance. When he called to check if they wanted to reschedule, they made excuses about being busy or said they had taken their car somewhere else just to try it out. He understood. People were curious about the new place, and the discounted prices were tempting. He did not blame them for looking for a better deal. Money was tight for most folks in Lipova. By the second week, the trickle of lost customers had become a stream. Thomas found himself with empty hours in his day, time that would normally be filled with work. He used it to organize his shop, to maintain his tools, to clean and prepare for customers who did not come. Young Martin still visited after school, and Thomas was grateful for the company. The boy did not understand the business side of things, just knew that his mentor seemed quieter and more worried than usual. "Is something wrong?" Martin asked one afternoon. Thomas considered lying but decided the boy deserved honesty. "Business is a little slow right now. There's a new repair shop in town and people are trying it out." "That's okay. It happens." But Martin's young face was troubled. "My mom took our car there last week. She said she felt bad about it, but the price was so much lower, and we need to save money where we can." "I'm sorry." Thomas put a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Don't be sorry. Your mother is doing what's best for your family. That's what good mothers do. I'm not angry at anyone for trying to save money. I understand completely." "But you helped us so many times," Martin said. "You fixed our car when we couldn't pay right away. You taught me about engines. It doesn't seem fair." "Life isn't always fair," Thomas said gently. "But that doesn't mean we stop trying to do what's right. Your mother will come back when she can. Until then, we'll manage." The boy looked doubtful, but he accepted Thomas's words with the trust of youth. They worked together on a small engine repair, Martin asking questions, and Thomas answering with his usual patient detail. For those few hours, the worries about money and competition faded into the background. This was what mattered, this passing of knowledge and skill from one generation to the next. This was wealth that could not be measured in currency. Pavel was less philosophical about the situation. He came by the workshop at the end of that second week and found Thomas sweeping an already clean floor, a sure sign that work was slow. His friend's face was grim as he settled onto his usual stool. "I've been hearing things," Pavel said without preamble, "about Marek's shop." "What kind of things?" Thomas asked, though he was not sure he wanted to know. Pavel pulled out his phone and showed Thomas a social media post. It was a review of Marek's shop, glowing with praise for the modern facility and professional service. Nothing wrong with that, except Pavel pointed to the date. This was posted 2 days before the shop even opened. It's a fake review. Thomas looked at more of the posts Pavel showed him. Dozens of 5-star ratings, all posted within days of the opening, many from accounts that seemed to have been created just to leave that one review. It was a coordinated campaign to make the new shop look established and trustworthy. "That's not honest," Thomas said quietly. "No, it's not," Pavel agreed. "But it's effective. People see all these good reviews and they assume the place must be great. They don't think to question whether the reviews are real. There's more." Pavel's expression darkened further. "I also heard that Marek has been telling customers that your shop isn't up to code, that your equipment is outdated and potentially unsafe. He's spreading rumors to drive people away from you." Thomas felt anger rise in him, hot and unfamiliar. He was not a man given to rage, but this felt like a violation of something fundamental. It was one thing to compete on price or service. It was another thing entirely to lie about a competitor's business. "That's slander. I've been inspected and certified every year for 3 decades. There's nothing unsafe about my shop." "I know that, and you know that," Pavel said. "But people who don't know you might believe it, especially if they see that shiny new facility and compare it to your older workshop. Appearances matter, even when they shouldn't." "What can I do?" Thomas asked, and he hated the defeat he heard in his own voice. Pavel thought for a long moment. You could fight back. Post your own reviews, your certifications, your history. Remind people what you've done for this community all these years. You could lower your prices to match his, at least temporarily. You could report the fake reviews and the false statements he's making. Thomas shook his head slowly. I won't lower my prices below what the work is worth. That's not honest, and I won't get into a public fight throwing accusations around. That's not who I am. Then what will you do? Pavel's voice was frustrated now. Just let him destroy your business with lies while you stand here being noble? Thomas did not have a good answer to that. He knew Pavel was right, that doing nothing might mean losing everything. But he also knew that compromising his principles to fight someone else's dirty tactics would be a different kind of loss, one that could not be measured in money. He would rather fail while staying true to himself than succeed by becoming something he was not. Maybe people will see through it, he said without much conviction. Maybe they'll remember the years I've been here and the work I've done. Maybe they'll value that more than flashy advertising and discounted prices. Pavel looked at his friend with a mixture of love and exasperation. You're a better man than I am. I would burn his shop down before I let him ruin me with lies. Not really, Thomas said with a small smile. You would complain loudly and threaten violence, but in the end you would do the right thing. That's why we're friends. We both know who we are. That's true, Pavel admitted. But knowing who you are doesn't pay the bills. What will you do if this continues? If the business keeps declining? Thomas had been asking himself the same question. His savings were modest, enough to last a few months if he was careful. After that, he would have to make hard choices. He could sell the workshop and the land it sat on, though the thought made his heart ache. It was his father's legacy, the place where he had spent his entire life. Or he could try to find other work, though at his age and with his specific skills, options were limited. Or he could admit defeat and leave Lipova entirely, start over somewhere else. Each option seemed worse than the last. I'll keep working, he said finally. I'll do the best I can with whatever business still comes my way. I'll trust that quality and honesty will matter in the end. And if they don't, then I'll have to figure something else out. But I won't compromise who I am to compete with someone who has no ethics. I won't become the thing I'm fighting against. Pavel nodded, accepting, if not agreeing with his friend's decision. They sat together in the growing darkness, two old friends facing an uncertain future with nothing but their history and their principles to sustain them. After Pavel left, Thomas remained in the workshop, running his hands over tools that had belonged to his father and grandfather. Each one had a story, a memory attached to it. This wrench had tightened the bolts on 100 engines. That hammer had shaped metal and fixed problems that seemed unfixable. These tools had fed his family for generations, had helped countless people get back on the road, had been instruments of honest work and good service. Could all of that really be destroyed by one vengeful man with money and no conscience? It seemed impossible, and yet here he was, watching it happen. The phone rang, startling him out of his thoughts. It was Anna, the widow whose wheel bearing he had fixed weeks ago. Her voice was hesitant, apologetic. Mr. Thomas, I have your money, all of it. I can bring it by tomorrow if that's okay. Of course, he told her. But there's no rush, whenever it's convenient for you. There was a pause, then she spoke again. I heard there's a new repair shop in town. cheaper prices. But I wanted to tell you, I'll keep coming to you. You helped me when I had nothing. You trusted me. That means more than any discount." Thomas felt his throat tighten with unexpected emotion. "Thank you, Anna. That means a great deal to me." After they hung up, he sat in the silence and thought about her words. Some people remembered. Some people valued character over convenience. Maybe that would be enough. Maybe loyalty and trust, built over years, would prove stronger than temporary price cuts and flashy marketing. Or maybe he was fooling himself. Only time would tell. The third week brought new challenges that Thomas had not anticipated. A building inspector showed up at his workshop unannounced, clipboard in hand, and a stern expression on his face. He introduced himself as Inspector Karl and said there had been complaints about potential code violations at the facility. Thomas was confused. What kind of complaints? Who complained? Inspector Karl was vague on the details. Anonymous tips, he said. Concerns about safety standards, proper ventilation, hazardous material storage. Just routine follow-up. Nothing to worry about if everything is in order. But the inspection was anything but routine. Inspector Karl went through the workshop with excruciating attention to detail, measuring distances between equipment, checking labels on containers, examining electrical outlets and fire extinguishers. He found minor issues that had never been problems before. This extension cord is not rated for continuous use in a commercial setting. This paint storage area needs better ventilation and signage. This oil disposal container needs to be a different type. He wrote up citation after citation, each one requiring corrections within 30 days, or Thomas would face fines. The inspector's manner suggested he was not just doing his job, but actively looking for problems. After 3 hours, he finally left with a list of required fixes that would cost Thomas several thousand crowns he did not have. Thomas stood in his workshop, looking at the citations, and felt the weight of them like physical burdens. None of these issues were serious. They were technicalities, minor points that could be interpreted different ways depending on how strictly you applied the regulations. It was clear someone had complained specifically to make his life difficult, and it was equally clear who that someone probably was. Pavel arrived that evening and found Thomas still staring at the paperwork. What now? He took the citations and read through them, his face growing darker with each page. This is harassment. Half of these are subjective interpretations. Any reasonable inspector would have given you verbal warnings at most. I know, Thomas said quietly. Then fight it. Appeal the citations. Get a lawyer. Pavel's voice was urgent now. You can't just accept this. But lawyers cost money I don't have, Thomas pointed out. And fighting the citations means time and energy I should be spending on work. That's exactly what they want. They want me to waste resources fighting bureaucratic battles while my business dies. So you'll just comply? Make all these expensive changes? What choice do I have? If I don't fix these issues, they'll shut me down. At least if I comply, I can keep working. Pavel wanted to argue more, but he could see the exhaustion in his friend's face. Thomas was not giving up exactly, but he was being ground down by forces larger than himself. It was painful to watch. I'll help you, Pavel said finally. Whatever you need to fix, I'll help. We'll get through this together. Thomas felt gratitude wash over him. Thank you. I don't know what I would do without you. You'll never have to find out, Pavel said firmly. That's what friends are for. Over the next few days, they worked together to address the citations. Pavel helped him install better ventilation in the paint storage area. They bought proper commercial extension cords and new storage containers that met the specific requirements. They added signage and labels and documentation. It took time and money that Thomas could ill afford, but slowly they checked items off the list. During this time, business continued to decline. More customers defected to Marek's shop, lured by the discounts and the modern facility. Thomas tried not to take it personally, but each lost customer felt like a small betrayal, even though he understood the practical reasons behind their choices. People needed to save money where they could. He could not fault them for that. What hurt more were the customers who stopped coming without explanation, the ones who had been loyal for years, but now avoided eye contact when they saw him in town. He suspected they had heard Marek's rumors about safety violations and outdated equipment. The inspector's visit would only have confirmed those suspicions in their minds. Why risk taking your car to a shop that might have problems when there was a shiny new alternative? Young Martin still came by faithfully, and his presence remained one of the few bright spots in Thomas's days. The boy was learning quickly, showing real aptitude for mechanical work. Thomas began teaching him more advanced skills, sharing knowledge he had accumulated over decades. If his business was failing, at least he could make sure this knowledge was not lost. One afternoon, while they were working on a carburetor rebuild, Martin asked a question that caught Thomas off guard. "Why do you keep doing this? Why don't you just quit and do something else?" Thomas considered how to answer. "Because this is who I am. It's not just what I do, it's part of my identity. My father taught me this trade, and his father taught him. When I work on an engine, I feel connected to them, to that whole history. I can't just walk away from that. But if you're losing money and people are being mean to you, isn't it better to stop? Wouldn't that be easier?" "Easier, yes," Thomas agreed. "But easier is not always better. Sometimes the right thing is hard. Sometimes you have to stand up for what you believe in, even when it costs you. That's what makes it meaningful." Martin thought about this seriously. "My mum says you're the most honest person she knows. She says there aren't many people like you anymore. Your mother is kind to say that. But I'm not special. I'm just trying to live according to the values I was taught. Anyone can do that, if they choose to." "But they don't," Martin said, with the blunt perception of youth. "Most people choose the easy way. That's why you're different." Thomas did not know how to respond to that. He had never thought of himself as different or special. He was just being himself, doing what seemed right. The fact that this was somehow unusual in the modern world was more a commentary on the world than on him. They finished the carburetor work in companionable silence, and when Martin left, Thomas felt a little less alone. That evening brought unexpected news. Anna the widow called again, her voice excited. "Mr. Thomas, I have to tell you something. I was at the Dvorak house today, cleaning, and I heard Mr. Dvorak on the phone. He was talking to someone about you, about your workshop." "What did he say?" Thomas asked, not sure he wanted to know. "He was telling someone that there's a campaign to drive you out of business, that it's being coordinated by Victor Stern, that man whose car you fixed. Mr. Dvorak sounded upset about it. He said it was wrong, that you were a good man, and didn't deserve this treatment." Thomas felt something shift in his chest. So it was confirmed. This was not paranoia or coincidence. Victor Stern really was behind everything. The new competitor, the fake reviews, the inspector's visit. It was all a calculated campaign of revenge for one refused tip. The pettiness of it was staggering. Did Mr. Dvorak say anything else? He said he was going to talk to some other people, try to do something about it. He said men like Victor Stern think they can do whatever they want because they have money, but that doesn't make it right. I thought you should know. Thank you, Anna. I appreciate you telling me. After the call ended, Thomas sat with this information. Part of him felt vindicated. He had been right about Victor Stern, right to see something empty and broken in the man. But he also felt a deep sadness that someone would go to such lengths to hurt another person over something so trivial spoke to a sickness in the soul. Victor Stern had everything money could buy, but apparently no peace, no contentment, no ability to let go of a perceived slight. In some ways, Thomas thought, he was the richer man. He might lose his business and his livelihood, but he still had his integrity. He could still look at himself in the mirror and respect what he saw. Could Victor Stern say the same? Probably not. Probably the man was eaten up inside by bitterness and ego and the constant need to prove his superiority. That was its own kind of poverty, far worse than any financial struggle. Pavel came by later with food from his store, insisting that Thomas eat something. They sat together, and Thomas told him what Anna had said. Pavel listened carefully, his expression thoughtful. So now you know for certain. The question is what you do with that knowledge. What can I do? Thomas asked. Victor Stern has money and power and connections. I have none of those things. Can't fight him on his terms. Then don't fight him on his terms, Pavel said. Fight him on yours. What does that mean? It means you keep being who you are. You keep doing quality work and treating people with respect. You keep living according to your principles. That's the one thing he can't take from you and can't compete with. You be so good, so honorable, so clearly in the right, that people can't help but see the difference between you and him. Thomas smiled despite himself. That's a nice idea. But nice ideas don't pay bills or fight coordinated smear campaigns. Maybe not, Pavel admitted. But they're all you've got, and sometimes that's enough. Sometimes the good guys do win, not through force or money, but just by refusing to give up or give in. Sometimes integrity is its own victory. I want to believe that, Thomas said quietly. I really do. Then believe it, Pavel urged, and keep going. Don't let Victor Stern turn you into something you're not. Don't let him take away your peace. That's what he wants, to make you bitter and angry and defeated. Don't give him that satisfaction. They finished their meal in silence, two old friends drawing strength from each other in difficult times. When Pavel left, Thomas cleaned up and prepared to close the workshop for the night. As he turned off the lights and locked the door, he made a decision. He would not fight Victor Stern with lawyers or public campaigns or any of the weapons a man like that would understand. He would simply continue being Thomas Novak, honest mechanic, good neighbor, faithful friend. If that was not enough to save his business, so be it. At least he would go down as himself, not as some twisted version of himself shaped by anger and compromise. It was cold comfort, perhaps, but it was the only comfort available. The call came on a Thursday morning when Thomas was working alone in his workshop. The voice on the other end was professional and unfamiliar, a woman who introduced herself as Petra from the law offices of Kralovec and Associates. She said she was calling on behalf of a client who wished to meet with Thomas regarding a business matter. Could he come to their offices in the city the following afternoon? Thomas was immediately suspicious. He did not have business with lawyers, and he could not imagine why anyone would want to meet with him in such a formal setting. "Is this about the citations?" he asked. "About the inspection?" "No, sir," Petra said. "This is a completely separate matter. My client prefers to discuss the details in person. I can assure you this is legitimate and potentially beneficial to you. It's quite important." Thomas almost refused outright. He did not trust sudden invitations from city lawyers. But something in the woman's tone made him hesitate. She sounded sincere, even kind. And what did he have to lose at this point? His business was already failing. Whatever this was, it could hardly make things worse. "All right," he agreed. "What time and where?" Petra gave him the address and a time of 3 o'clock the next day. She thanked him for his willingness to meet and said she looked forward to seeing him. After the call ended, Thomas stood holding the phone, trying to make sense of it. He called Pavel and told him about the strange invitation. Pavel's first reaction was the same as Thomas's had been: suspicion and concern. "It could be a trap," he said. "Victor, Stern might be trying to get you to sign something or admit to something. You should not go alone. I'll come with you." Thomas appreciated his friend's protectiveness, but shook his head. "If it's a trap, having you there won't change anything. And if it's legitimate, then I need to hear what they have to say. But I'll be careful. I promise." The next day, Thomas closed his workshop early and made the drive to the city. It had been months since he had been in the urban center, and the traffic and noise felt overwhelming after the quiet of Lipova. He found the law offices in a modern building downtown, all glass and steel and expensive furnishings. The receptionist greeted him warmly and showed him to a conference room where Petra was waiting. She was younger than he had expected, maybe 40, with kind eyes and a professional manner. She shook his hand and offered him coffee, which he accepted gratefully. Then she explained why he was there, and nothing could have prepared Thomas for what she said. "Mr. Novak, my client has been following your situation with interest. They have learned about the campaign being waged against your business by Victor Stern, and they find it deeply troubling. They would like to help you if you're willing to accept that help." Thomas felt his guard go up immediately. "Who is your client? Why would they want to help me?" "I don't understand." Petra smiled gently. "My client prefers to remain anonymous for now, but I can tell you they are someone with significant resources and a strong belief in fairness and justice. They have seen what Victor Stern is doing to you, and they believe it's wrong. They want to level the playing field." Thomas shook his head slowly. "I don't want charity. I don't want to be anyone's project or cause. I appreciate the thought, but I'll handle my own problems." "I understand your pride," Petra said, "but this is not charity. Consider it an investment in what's right. My client is not asking for anything in return. They simply want to ensure that a good man is not destroyed by a petty tyrant. They believe that what's happening to you is emblematic of a larger problem in society, where people with money can crush those without it simply because they can." She slid a folder across the table to him. Inside were documents, bank statements, legal filings. Evidence of everything Victor Stern had done: the shell companies funding Marek's shop, the payments to Inspector Karl for aggressive enforcement, the social media campaign of fake reviews. Everything Thomas had suspected was there in black and white, documented and verified. This proof of harassment and unfair business practices, Petra explained. With this evidence, you could file a lawsuit against Victor Stern. You would have a strong case. My client is willing to fund that lawsuit, to provide you with top legal representation at no cost to you." Thomas looked at the documents with a mixture of anger and sorrow. Seeing it all laid out like this, the calculated cruelty of it, made him feel sick. But he also felt something else, a reluctance that surprised him. If I sue him, it becomes a fight. It becomes about winning and losing, about revenge. That's not who I am. You would not be seeking revenge, Petra said gently. You would be seeking justice. There's a difference. Victor Stern is using his wealth to harm you illegally. He should face consequences for that. Other people in your position might not have someone willing to help them. By standing up to him, you might prevent him from doing this to someone else. Thomas had not thought of it that way. He had been so focused on his own principles and his own situation that he had not considered the bigger picture. If Victor Stern could do this to him and get away with it, he would do it to others. The man clearly saw people as obstacles to be removed or tools to be used. Someone needed to show him there were limits, that actions had consequences. But even as he thought this, Thomas felt uncomfortable with the idea of a lawsuit. It seemed aggressive, adversarial in a way that went against his nature. "I need time to think about this," he said finally. "This is a lot to process." "Of course," Petra said. "Take all the time you need. But I should tell you there's more." She pulled out another folder. "My client has also looked into Marek's operation. It turns out his shop is not as legitimate as it appears. He's been cutting corners on repairs, using substandard parts while charging for premium ones, failing to perform services he claims to have done. Several customers have already had problems with work he did. It's only a matter of time before someone gets hurt." Thomas felt a chill. That was worse than unfair competition. That was dangerous. If someone's brakes failed because of shoddy work, people could die. "We have documented evidence of these practices," Petra continued. "Evidence that could be turned over to regulatory authorities. Marek could lose his business license. The question is whether you want to be involved in making that happen." "Why me?" Thomas asked. "Why does your client need me to be involved?" "Because it carries more weight coming from an established local mechanic with a reputation for integrity," Petra explained. "If you file a complaint along with the evidence, authorities will take it seriously. If it just comes from an anonymous source, it might be dismissed as hearsay or rivalry. Your name means something. Your reputation matters." Thomas stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city below. So many people, so many lives intersecting in ways they would never know about. He had come here expecting trouble and instead found an opportunity, a chance to fight back with tools he had never possessed before. But it required him to step into a role he had never wanted, to become active in bringing down other people, even if they deserved it. "I built my life on doing good work and helping people," he said quietly. "Not on destroying others, even when they deserve it." "I understand," Petra said. "But sometimes doing good work and helping people requires standing up to those who would stop you from doing that work. Sometimes kindness needs to be backed by strength, or it becomes weakness that others exploit." Thomas turned to face her. "Who is your client? Please, I need to know. Why are they doing this?" Petra hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. "I can tell you this much. My client knows Victor Stern personally. They have seen firsthand the kind of man he is and the damage he does. They tried to work with him, to show him a better way. But he would not listen. He cannot be reasoned with or appealed to. He only understands power and consequences. When they learned what he was doing to you, they saw a chance to do something meaningful, to help someone who deserves it, and maybe teach Victor Stern a lesson he desperately needs to learn. Is your client someone he hurt? Someone seeking their own revenge? No, Petra said firmly. My client has no personal grievance with Victor Stern beyond disgust at his behavior. This truly is about you and about what's right. I know that's hard to believe in a world where everyone seems to have hidden motives. But sometimes people do good things, simply because they're good things to do. Thomas wanted to believe her, but decades of life had taught him to be cautious about offers that seemed too good to be true. Still, the documents in those folders were real. The evidence was concrete, and the opportunity to protect others from Victor Stern's vindictiveness and Marek's dangerous practices was compelling. Can I take these with me? He asked, gesturing to the folders. I need to think about all of this, talk to some people I trust. Of course, Petra said. Take all the time you need. But Mr. Novak, please consider this carefully. The offer will not be available indefinitely. My client is willing to help, but they need to know you're willing to help yourself. Thomas gathered the folders and shook Petra's hand. Thank you for this. Whatever I decide, I appreciate someone caring enough to try to help. As he drove back to Lipova, his mind was churning with possibilities and questions. Who was this mysterious client? Why did they really care about his situation? What did they stand to gain from helping him? And more importantly, what was the right thing to do? He had spent his entire life avoiding conflict, choosing peace and principle over confrontation. But maybe Petra was right. Maybe there came a time when you had to fight, not for yourself, but for others who might suffer if you did nothing. When he reached Lipova, instead of going home, he drove straight to Pavel's store. His friend took one look at his face and locked the door, putting up the closed sign. They sat in the back room, and Thomas told him everything, spreading the documents out on the table between them. Pavel read through them with growing amazement and anger. This is incredible. This proves everything. You have to use this. You have to stop Victor Stern and shut down Marek before someone gets killed. But who is behind this? Thomas asked. Who is this mysterious client? And what do they really want? Does it matter? Pavel countered. Look at what they're offering you. A chance to save your business, to bring justice, to protect people. Why question the motives when the outcome is clearly good? Because nothing is free, Thomas said. There's always a cost, always strings attached. I don't want to be anyone's pawn in some larger game I don't understand. They sat in silence for a long moment. Finally, Pavel spoke, his voice softer than before. Maybe this is not about them at all. Maybe this is about you choosing what kind of man you want to be. You have spent your whole life being kind and generous and principled. That's beautiful. But maybe now life is asking you to be something more. Maybe now you need to be brave enough to fight for what you believe in, not just live it quietly. Thomas felt tears prick at his eyes. I don't want to fight. I never wanted that. I know, Pavel said gently. But sometimes we don't get to choose our battles. They choose us. And when they do, we have to decide whether we're going to stand up or step aside. If you step aside now, Victor Stern wins. Marek keeps endangering people, and you lose everything you've built. Is that really the honorable choice? Or is honor sometimes about being willing to get your hands dirty, to protect what matters? Thomas had no answer to that. He gathered up the documents and went home, his mind and heart in turmoil. That night he sat in the house where he had been born, surrounded by memories of his father and Helena, and a lifetime of choices made according to his principles. And he prayed for wisdom to know what to do next. Thomas spent 3 days wrestling with his decision. He spread the documents across his kitchen table and read through them again and again, each time finding more evidence of Victor Stern's calculated cruelty and Marek's dangerous incompetence. The weight of what he knew pressed down on him like a physical burden. Every time he thought he had made up his mind, doubt would creep back in. Was he really the right person to do this? Was fighting back the right choice, or was he simply being tempted away from his principles by anger and wounded pride? On the morning of the 4th day, something happened that made the decision for him. A young woman named Katerina came to his workshop in tears. Her car had broken down on the highway the previous night. The brakes had completely failed, and she had narrowly avoided a serious accident. Only luck and an empty stretch of road had saved her life. The car had been serviced at Marek's shop just 2 weeks earlier. Thomas towed her vehicle to his workshop and put it up on the lift. What he found made his blood run cold. The brake pads that Marek had supposedly replaced were actually the old worn ones, simply cleaned and reinstalled. The brake fluid had not been changed despite being listed on the service receipt. Several critical components were loose or improperly installed. It was criminally negligent work that could have killed Katerina and anyone else on the road with her. He took detailed photographs and notes, then called Katerina to explain what he had found. She was shocked and angry, but also frightened. What if she had been driving with her children in the car? What if the brakes had failed in traffic instead of on an empty highway? She wanted to report Marek immediately, but she was also worried about retaliation. Thomas made a decision in that moment. This was no longer about him or his business, or even about Victor Stern's petty revenge. This was about protecting innocent people from a dangerous fraud. He told Katerina he would take care of everything, that she should not worry about retaliation. He had resources now to make sure the right thing happened. After she left, he called Petra at the law office. When she answered, he did not waste time with pleasantries. "I'm in. Whatever your client needs me to do, I'll do it. We need to stop Victor Stern, and we need to shut down Marek before he kills someone." The next week was a whirlwind of activity, unlike anything Thomas had experienced before. Petra came to Lipova with a team of lawyers and investigators. They interviewed Katerina and documented the problems with her car. They found 3 other customers who had similar experiences with Marek's shop, work that was charged for but not performed, substandard parts substituted for premium ones, dangerous mistakes that could have led to accidents. Each person added their testimony to a growing file of evidence. Thomas showed the investigators his workshop, his records, his certifications. They photographed everything and interviewed him at length about his business practices and history. They talked to people in town who vouched for his character and competence. They built a picture of an honest man being systematically destroyed by a vindictive millionaire and his unethical proxy. Pavel was there every step of the way, providing support and encouragement. He brought food when Thomas forgot to eat, made coffee during long, late-night strategy sessions, and offered his opinion when asked. He watched his friend transform from someone being acted upon to someone taking action, and he felt proud even as he worried about the toll this was taking. Young Martin noticed the change, too. Thomas was distracted during their work sessions, his mind clearly elsewhere. Finally, the boy asked what was happening. Thomas considered how much to share with someone so young, then decided honesty was always best. "I'm fighting back," he explained simply, "against the people who have been trying to destroy my business. It's complicated and sometimes scary, but it's the right thing to do." "Will you win?" Martin asked with the directness of youth. "I don't know," Thomas admitted, "but I have to try. Sometimes standing up is more important than winning." The boy thought about this. "My mum says you're the bravest person she knows, not because you're not afraid, but because you do the right thing even when you are afraid. Your mother is a wise woman, and yes, I'm afraid. But I'm also angry, which is unusual for me. Angry that people are being hurt by someone's greed and ego. That anger is giving me strength I didn't know I had." On the 8th day after his meeting with Petra, everything was ready. The lawyers had prepared multiple legal actions: a lawsuit against Victor Stern for harassment, unfair business practices, and conspiracy. A formal complaint against Marek to the licensing board with extensive documentation of his negligent work. A referral to law enforcement regarding potential fraud charges. All of it backed by irrefutable evidence and multiple witness statements. Petra came to Lipova one last time before they filed everything. She sat with Thomas in his workshop and reviewed what would happen next. "Once we file these actions, there's no going back. Victor Stern will know you're behind it. He will likely retaliate in whatever ways he can. You need to be prepared for that." "I'm prepared," Thomas said, with more confidence than he felt. "What can he do to me that he hasn't already tried?" Petra looked at him seriously. "He could make your life very difficult in ways you haven't experienced yet. Legal harassment, public attacks on your character, attempts to intimidate you. He's a powerful man with a lot of resources and no apparent conscience. My client will protect you as much as possible, but you need to understand the risk." Thomas thought about Katerina's near-death experience, about the other customers who had been endangered by Marek's incompetence. He thought about all the years he had worked, honestly and fairly, only to be targeted for destruction because he had offended a rich man's pride. He thought about his father's teachings that some things were worth standing up for, even when the cost was high. "I understand the risk," he said firmly, "and I accept it. This is bigger than me now. This is about stopping someone who sees people as disposable obstacles. If I don't stand up to him, who will? The next person he targets might not have someone willing to help them. I have that chance now, and I won't waste it." Petra smiled, genuine warmth in her expression. "My client said you would respond this way. They said you were the kind of man who would do the right thing once you understood what was at stake." They were correct. "Who is your client?" Thomas asked one more time. "Please, I think I've earned the right to know." Petra hesitated, then nodded. "You have. But I'm asking you to wait just a little longer. My client has promised to reveal themselves to you in person once these actions are filed and the initial responses come back. They want to meet you face to face and explain everything. Can you trust me for just a few more days?" Thomas wanted to push, but he recognized he had no leverage. He was dependent on this mysterious benefactor's generosity and resources. If they wanted anonymity for a while longer, he would have to accept that. "All right, I'll wait. But I want answers soon." "You'll have them," Petra promised. "Now, let's talk about what happens tomorrow. The papers will be filed first thing in the morning. By noon, Victor Stern and Marek will both be served. The news will probably spread quickly through the business community. You should expect media attention, possibly reporters coming to talk to you. "Do you feel comfortable speaking to the press?" Thomas had never imagined being in such a position, but he nodded slowly. "If it helps expose what they've done, yes. I'll talk to reporters." "Just tell the truth," Petra advised. "Tell your story, simply and honestly. That's your greatest strength. Don't let anyone provoke you into anger or exaggeration. Let the facts speak for themselves." They spent another hour going over details and potential scenarios. When Petra finally left, Thomas felt exhausted, but also strangely energized. After weeks of being passive, of watching his world crumble around him, he was finally taking action. It felt good in a way he had not expected. That evening, Pavel organized a small gathering at his store. Anna was there, and Katerina, and several other people from town who had stood by Thomas through the difficulties. They ate and talked, and the conversation was warm with friendship and support. These were his people, Thomas realized. This was his community. Whatever happened with the legal actions, whatever Victor Stern tried to do, he had something the wealthy man did not. He had genuine connections, real relationships built on years of mutual respect and care. That was wealth of a kind that could not be bought or destroyed. As the evening wound down and people began to leave, each one hugged Thomas or shook his hand and told him they were proud of him. Anna kissed his cheek and whispered that he was doing what his father would have wanted. Pavel was the last to go, lingering after everyone else had left. "You ready for this?" he asked his old friend. "As ready as I'll ever be," Thomas replied. "Scared but determined." "That's the best way to be," Pavel said. "Scared means you understand the stakes. Determined means you won't quit. You're going to do fine." After Pavel left, Thomas walked slowly back to his workshop. He let himself in and stood in the darkness, breathing in the familiar smells of oil and metal and old memories. This place represented everything he was and everything he valued. His father had built it with his own hands. Thomas had maintained it and honored it with decades of honest work. If he lost it now in the fight ahead, at least he would lose it while standing up for what was right. He thought about Victor Stern in his glass tower in the city, probably working late as men like him always did. Did Victor ever stop to think about the human cost of his actions? Did he care that his wounded pride had led him to try to destroy a good man's livelihood? Did he feel any remorse or doubt? Probably not. Men like Victor Stern had long ago traded their capacity for empathy for the pursuit of power and wealth. They saw the world in terms of winners and losers, strong and weak, useful and disposable. They could not understand someone like Thomas who measured success in different terms. But tomorrow, Victor Stern was going to learn that not everyone could be bullied or bought. Tomorrow, he would discover that actions had consequences, even for the wealthy and powerful. And tomorrow, Thomas Novak would step out of the shadows and into a fight he had never wanted, but would see through to the end. He locked up the workshop and went home to try to sleep, knowing rest would be difficult. His mind was too full of what was coming, of all the ways things could go right or wrong. But underneath the anxiety was something else, a quiet satisfaction that came from finally taking a stand. Win or lose, he would be able to look at himself in the mirror and know he had done his best, had stayed true to his principles while also protecting others. That was worth whatever price he might have to pay. The night was long, but eventually morning came, bringing with it the beginning of the end of this strange chapter in his life. Thomas rose before dawn, made his simple breakfast, and prepared to face whatever the day would bring. He was ready. The legal papers were filed at 9 in the morning. By 10, Petra called to confirm that both Victor Stern and Marek had been served. By 11, Thomas's phone started ringing. The first call was from a local newspaper reporter who had somehow gotten wind of the lawsuit. She asked if Thomas would be willing to give an interview about his case against one of the region's most prominent businessmen. Thomas remembered Petra's advice to tell the truth simply and honestly, so he agreed. The reporter arrived at his workshop within the hour, a young woman named Lucy with sharp eyes and a recorder. She asked him to tell his story from the beginning, and he did. He explained about Victor Stern's car breaking down, about fixing it and refusing the excessive tip, about everything that had happened since. He showed her the citations from the inspector, talked about the campaign against his business, explained about Marek's dangerous practices that had nearly killed Katerina. Lucy listened intently, occasionally asking clarifying questions. When Thomas finished, she was quiet for a moment. "This is bigger than I thought. Victor Stern has a reputation for being ruthless in business, but I've never heard of him going after someone so small-scale. It suggests a level of pettiness that's almost pathological." "I just want it to stop," Thomas said quietly. "I want my business back. I want people to be safe. And I want Victor Stern to understand that not everyone can be bullied just because he has money." The interview lasted an hour. When Lucy left, she promised the story would run the next day. Thomas felt exposed and vulnerable, knowing his life was about to become public in ways he had never wanted. But he also felt a strange sense of relief. The truth was coming out. People would know what had happened. That had to count for something. The second call came in early afternoon. It was a lawyer representing Victor Stern, a man with a cold professional voice who informed Thomas that his client categorically denied all allegations and would be countersuing for defamation and harassment. The lawsuit Thomas had filed was without merit and would be vigorously defended. Victor Stern would not be intimidated by baseless accusations from a failing business owner looking for someone to blame for his own inadequacies. Thomas listened to the lawyer's threats without responding, then hung up. Petra had warned him this would happen. Victor Stern would fight back with everything he had. The question was whether Thomas had the strength to withstand that fight. The third call was from Marek himself. The younger man's voice was shaking with rage. "You have no right to destroy my business with lies. I've done nothing wrong. Everything I do is professional and up to code. You're just jealous because I'm more successful than you. You're a bitter old man who can't compete." Thomas felt his own anger rise, but kept his voice level. "I have photographs of the work you did on Katerina's car. I have testimony from multiple customers about your practices. None of that is lies. You've been endangering people's lives to save money, and that needs to stop." Marek's voice went from angry to threatening. "You better drop this lawsuit. You don't know who you're dealing with. Victor Stern has friends everywhere. He can make your life hell. You think things have been bad? You have no idea what we can do to you." "I'm not dropping anything," Thomas said firmly. "And I'm recording this call, so please continue making threats. It will only help my case." Marek hung up abruptly. Thomas was not actually recording, but the bluff had worked. He reported the threatening call to Petra, who added it to their documentation. Each action Victor Stern and his associates took was only strengthening the case against them. By late afternoon, news of the lawsuit had spread through Lipova. People started stopping by the workshop to express their support or ask questions. Some were customers who had left for Marek's shop, and now felt guilty about it. Others were simply curious about the drama unfolding in their small town. Thomas tried to be gracious with everyone, explaining what he could without going into details that might compromise the legal case. Pavel closed his store early and came to help field questions and provide moral support. Together, they handled the steady stream of visitors until finally things quieted down as evening approached. "You did good today," Pavel said, as they sat on their usual bench. "I know it wasn't easy, but you handled everything with dignity." Thomas felt exhausted. "I never wanted any of this attention. I just wanted to fix cars and live quietly." "I know," Pavel said, "but sometimes life has other plans. Sometimes we're called to do more than we thought we could. You're doing that now." The next morning brought the newspaper article. Lucy had done a thorough job, presenting Thomas's story alongside the documented evidence of Victor Stern's campaign and Marek's negligent work. The article was fair and factual, but it painted a damning picture of a wealthy bully using his resources to crush a small competitor who had offended him. The story included a statement from Victor Stern's lawyer, denying everything and calling the allegations a desperate attempt at extortion. But the evidence Lucy had seen spoke for itself. By noon, the story had been picked up by regional news outlets. By evening, it was trending on social media. People across the country were reading about the mechanic who had stood up to a millionaire and the millionaire who could not handle rejection. Public opinion was strongly in Thomas's favor. Comments poured in, praising his integrity and condemning Victor Stern's actions. The story resonated with people who had their own experiences with arrogant, wealthy individuals who thought money made them untouchable. Victor Stern found himself in an unfamiliar position. He was used to controlling narratives, to having the power to shape public perception through his connections and resources. But this story had gotten away from him. The evidence was too clear. The contrast between Thomas's humble honesty and his own vindictive behavior too stark. For the first time in years, he was facing real consequences for his actions. His business partners started distancing themselves. His social circle began to gossip. His reputation, carefully cultivated over decades, was taking serious damage. And the man responsible was a simple mechanic in a small town who had done nothing more than refuse a tip and insist on fairness. Victor sat in his office looking at the news coverage and felt something unfamiliar, a combination of rage and shame that he did not know how to process. How had this happened? How had such a minor incident spiraled so far out of his control? He had crushed bigger obstacles with ease. He had destroyed competitors and enemies without breaking a sweat. But this one quiet man had somehow become an immovable object, a symbol of something Victor could not buy or intimidate. His lawyer advised settling the lawsuit quickly and quietly, paying Thomas whatever he wanted to make the story go away. But Victor's pride would not allow it. To settle would be to admit defeat, to acknowledge that he had been wrong. He could not do that. He would fight this to the end, would use every legal tactic and resource available. He would prove that Victor Stern did not lose to nobodies from nowhere. 3 days after the news story broke, Petra called with unexpected information. "Thomas, my client wants to meet with you. Today, if possible. They feel the time has come to reveal themselves and explain everything. They'll be in Lipova this afternoon. Are you available?" Thomas's heart raced. Finally, he would get answers to the questions that had been plaguing him since this all began. "Of course. Where should I meet them?" "Your workshop," Petra said. "They want to see where you work. To meet you on your own ground. They'll arrive at 4 o'clock. Thomas spent the hours until then cleaning his workshop obsessively, organizing tools that were already organized, sweeping floors that were already clean. Pavel found him at 3:30, still tidying nervously. "They're going to like you regardless of how clean your floor is," Pavel said with amusement. "This person has already invested significant resources in helping you. I don't think dust is going to change their opinion." "I know," Thomas admitted. "I just need to do something with my hands. I'm more nervous about this meeting than I was about the lawsuit." At precisely 4 o'clock, a modest car pulled up outside the workshop. Petra got out, followed by another person. As they approached, Thomas felt his breath catch in his throat. The mysterious benefactor was Helena's younger sister, Elena. He had not seen her in over 20 years, not since Helena's funeral when grief had driven them apart. She looked older now, her hair grey and her face lined with the years. But her eyes were still the same warm brown he remembered. She smiled at his shocked expression. "Hello, Thomas. It's been a long time." "Elena," he managed to say. "I don't understand. What are you doing here? How is this possible?" She gestured to the bench outside his workshop. "Can we sit? I have a lot to explain." They sat together while Petra stood at a respectful distance. Pavel had quietly disappeared into his store, giving them privacy. Elena took Thomas's hand in hers, and he felt the connection to a past he thought was lost forever. "After Helena died, I left Lipova," she began. "The memories were too painful. I moved to the city, worked hard, got lucky with some investments. Over the years, I built a successful business, made more money than I ever imagined having. But I never forgot where I came from. I never forgot you." Thomas felt tears prick at his eyes. "Why didn't you reach out? Why stay away all these years?" "Because I was angry at you," she admitted. "When Helena was dying, she wanted to marry you. She wanted whatever time she had left to be as your wife. But you refused. You said it wasn't right to marry someone who was dying, that it would be like taking advantage of her vulnerability. She was heartbroken, and I blamed you for denying her that final wish." Thomas felt old grief wash over him. "I thought I was protecting her. I thought marriage in those circumstances would have been selfish of me. Like I was trying to claim her before she was gone. I loved her too much to do that." "I know that now," Elena said gently. "It took me years to understand that you were acting from love, not rejection. Helena knew it too, eventually. In her final days, she told me she understood why you had said no, that it was just one more proof of your goodness. She made me promise to forgive you, to not let her death poison my memories of the man she loved. But I couldn't keep that promise for a long time. I was too hurt." "So why now?" Thomas asked. "Why come back into my life after all these years?" She pulled out her phone and showed him the news article about his lawsuit against Victor Stern. "When I saw this story, I saw Helena's Thomas, the same man who would refuse a fortune rather than compromise his principles, the same man who would put others before himself, and I saw him being destroyed by someone like Victor Stern, someone who represents everything Helena and I always despised: greed, arrogance, cruelty, disguised as success. I couldn't stand by and watch that happen." Thomas understood now. "You're the mysterious client. You're the one who funded everything, the investigation, the lawyers, all of it. Why stay anonymous? Why not just come to me directly?" "Because I wasn't sure how you would react to seeing me again," Elena explained. and I wasn't sure I could face you without falling apart. So much time had passed, but the grief was still there. I thought it would be easier to help from a distance. But then, as I watched you handle everything with such grace and courage, I realized I needed to do this properly. I needed to face you and explain and maybe find some closure for both of us. They sat in silence for a moment, both processing the weight of emotions and years. Finally, Thomas spoke. Helena would be proud of what you've become. She always said you were stronger than you thought. And she would be proud of you too, Helena said. Still fighting for what's right, even when it costs you everything. That was what she loved most about you. Thomas felt something loosen in his chest, a knot of old grief and regret that had been there for decades. I'm sorry I couldn't give her what she wanted at the end. I'm sorry I hurt you both. You gave her what she needed, Helena corrected him. You gave her love without conditions, without expecting anything in return. That was more valuable than a wedding ceremony. She knew that. I should have known it too. They talked for hours, sharing memories of Helena, filling in the gaps of 20 lost years. Helena told him about her business success, about the companies she had built and the causes she supported. She had used her wealth to help people who needed it, to fight injustice where she found it. When she had learned about Victor, Stern's campaign against Thomas, it had felt like fate was giving her a chance to honor Helena's memory by protecting the man her sister had loved. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the workshop, Thomas finally asked the question that had been on his mind. What happens now? With the lawsuit? With everything? Petra says we have a strong case, Helena replied. Victor Stern is making it worse for himself by fighting instead of settling. Every legal motion he files, every threatening statement his lawyers make, just adds to the evidence of his character. The licensing board is investigating Marek and will likely revoke his license. Several of his customers are filing their own lawsuits. It's all falling apart for them. And you? Thomas asked. What do you want from all of this? Nothing, Helena said simply. I already have what I wanted. I got to help someone who deserves it. I got to stand up to a bully, and I got to reconnect with the man my sister loved, to finally make peace with the past. That's worth more than any legal victory. Petra approached them as darkness fell. I hate to interrupt, but we should discuss next steps. The judge has set a preliminary hearing for next week. We need to prepare you for testimony, Mr. Novak. Over the following days, Thomas prepared for his court appearance with Petra's guidance. He reviewed documents, practiced answering questions, learned about legal procedures. It was intimidating, but Elena's presence made it bearable. She attended every preparation session, offering encouragement and reminding him that he only needed to tell the truth. The truth was his greatest weapon. The hearing arrived on a cold morning. Thomas wore his only suit, an old one that Pavel had helped him select years ago for a funeral. He felt uncomfortable and out of place as he entered the courthouse. But when he saw Victor Stern, sitting with his team of expensive lawyers, looking arrogant and untouchable, Thomas felt his nervousness transform into determination. This was the moment that mattered. Not the news stories or the public opinion, but this official proceeding where truth would be weighed against power. The hearing lasted 3 hours. Thomas testified clearly and honestly about everything that had happened. He presented evidence, answered questions from both sides, remained calm even when Victor Stern's lawyers tried to rattle him with aggressive questioning. He was not eloquent or polished, but he was genuine. and that sincerity came through in every word. When it was Victor Stern's turn to testify, the difference was stark. He was smooth and practiced, but there was something hollow in his testimony. He denied personal involvement in the campaign against Thomas, claimed everything had been done by overzealous employees without his knowledge. But the evidence said otherwise. The paper trail led directly back to him. The judge, an older woman with sharp eyes and no patience for nonsense, listened to everything with careful attention. At the end, she made a preliminary ruling. Based on the evidence presented, there appears to be substantial merit to Mr. Novak's claims. I am granting a temporary restraining order, preventing Mr. Stern or any of his associates from further interference with Mr. Novak's business. I am also referring certain aspects of this case to the prosecutor's office for potential criminal investigation. We will reconvene in 30 days for a full hearing. Victor Stern's face went red with anger and humiliation. He stood abruptly and left the courtroom without a word, his lawyers hurrying after him. Thomas sat quietly, hardly daring to believe what had just happened. He had won, at least this first battle. The weeks that followed the hearing brought changes to Lipova that no one could have predicted. The news coverage of Victor Stern's legal defeat spread even wider than the original story. People across the country had followed the case of the humble mechanic, standing up to the vindictive millionaire, and now they celebrated his victory. Customers who had left Thomas's workshop began returning, many of them apologetic and embarrassed. He welcomed them back without judgment or recrimination. Business slowly returned to what it had been before, then began to grow beyond that. People from neighboring towns started bringing their vehicles to him, drawn by his reputation for honesty and integrity. Within a month, his appointment book was fuller than it had been in years. Marek's shop closed its doors permanently after the licensing board revoked his certification. The investigation into his practices had revealed even more problems than initially suspected, enough to warrant criminal charges for fraud and reckless endangerment. Marek left town quietly, his dreams of easy money destroyed by his own shortcuts and dishonesty. Victor Stern faced consequences that money could not easily fix. The criminal investigation that the judge had ordered uncovered a pattern of behavior extending far beyond what he had done to Thomas. Other business owners came forward with similar stories of harassment and intimidation. His business empire began to crumble as partners distanced themselves and investors pulled their support. The man who had seemed untouchable was learning that even wealth and power had limits. 2 months after the hearing, Victor Stern's lawyers approached Petra with a settlement offer. He would pay substantial damages to Thomas, would publicly apologize for his actions, and would agree to never interfere with Thomas's business again. In return, Thomas would agree to drop the lawsuit and not pursue further legal action. Petra brought the offer to Thomas and Elena. They met in the workshop that had become the center of this whole saga. Elena looked at the settlement terms and smiled. This is a complete victory. He's admitting defeat and paying for his actions. You should accept this. Thomas read through the papers carefully. The amount of money being offered was more than he would earn in 5 years. It would secure his future, allow him to upgrade his equipment, maybe even hire help. It was everything he could have hoped for in practical terms. But something bothered him. What about the other people he's hurt? Does this settlement help them? That's not your responsibility, Petra said gently. You've already done more than anyone could have expected. You stood up to him and won. You showed that he can be held accountable. That helps everyone. But Thomas shook his head. If I take this money and drop the case, does that stop the criminal investigation? Does it help the other business owners who came forward? Or does it just save Victor Stern from facing the full consequences of his actions? The settlement is just between you and him, Petra explained. The criminal investigation continues regardless. The other civil cases proceed on their own. Your decision doesn't affect those. Then I want to add a condition, Thomas said. I'll accept the settlement only if Victor Stern also agrees to make restitution to the other people he's harmed. Not just money, but public acknowledgement and real amends. If he wants my forgiveness, he needs to earn it by making things right with everyone. Petra looked surprised. That's going to make the settlement much more complicated. He may not agree to it. Then we go to trial, Thomas said simply. I didn't start this fight for money. I started it to stop him from hurting people. If he's not willing to truly change his behavior, then the money doesn't mean anything. Elena reached over and squeezed his hand. Helena chose well when she loved you. You haven't changed at all. The negotiations took another 3 weeks. Victor Stern initially refused Thomas's additional conditions, but his legal position continued to deteriorate as more evidence came to light. Finally, facing the very real possibility of criminal charges and complete financial ruin, he agreed to everything. He would pay damages not just to Thomas, but to 6 other business owners he had harmed. He would fund a business ethics program at the local university. He would make a public statement accepting full responsibility for his actions and apologizing without reservation. The final settlement was signed on a spring morning when the world felt new and full of possibility. Thomas stood in his workshop afterwards, holding the check that represented his financial security, and felt strangely empty. He had won, but it did not feel the way he had imagined. There was no triumph, no sense of having beaten an enemy. There was just relief that it was over, and a quiet satisfaction that some good had come from all the struggle. Pavel found him there an hour later, still holding the check and staring at nothing. You did it, my friend. You fought the monster and won. Did I, though? Thomas asked. Victor Stern wrote a check and made some promises. But has he really changed? Will he treat people differently now? Or has he just learned to be more careful about getting caught? Pavel considered this. Maybe both. Maybe neither. But that's not your responsibility. You did what you could. You stood up when it mattered. You protected people who needed protecting. You showed everyone that integrity still counts for something. That's enough. That has to be enough. Young Martin burst into the workshop then, full of the energy of youth. Mr. Thomas, I saw the news. You're famous. Everyone at school is talking about how you beat that rich man. The adults are saying you're a hero. Thomas smiled and ruffled the boy's hair. I'm not a hero. I just did what needed to be done. That's what makes you a hero, Martin insisted. Heroes are just regular people who do the right thing when it's hard. You taught me that. Over the following months, life in Lipova gradually returned to normal, though it was a new normal shaped by all that had happened. Thomas hired Martin part-time to help with simple repairs, teaching him the trade just as his father had taught him. The boy was a quick learner with good hands and a strong work ethic. Watching him grow in skill and confidence gave Thomas a sense of continuity, of knowledge and values being passed to the next generation. Elena became a regular presence in his life again. She divided her time between the city and Lipova, staying in the small house she had inherited from her parents and spending long hours with Thomas. They talked about Helena often, sharing memories that kept her alive between them. The grief that had separated them for so long became the thing that reconnected them, transformed from a wound into a bridge. She helped him modernize his business, not with flashy equipment or aggressive marketing, but with smart improvements that made his work easier and more efficient. A better computer system for tracking repairs and inventory. Updated diagnostic tools that worked with newer vehicles. Proper lighting and ventilation that made the workspace healthier. She funded it all as a gift, refusing any repayment. "This is my investment in honoring Helena's memory," she said. "She would want me to take care of you." Victor Stern largely disappeared from public life after the settlement. He sold off most of his business interests and moved to another part of the country. Rumors said he was trying to rebuild his reputation through quiet philanthropy, but Thomas paid little attention to such stories. The man was no longer his concern. Whether Victor Stern found redemption or remained forever bitter was between him and his conscience. Thomas had done what he could and moved on. One evening, almost a year after that first fateful day when Victor's car had broken down outside his workshop, Thomas sat on the bench with Pavel watching the sunset. They had done this countless times over the decades of their friendship, but tonight felt different somehow. More peaceful, more complete. "Do you ever regret it?" Pavel asked. "All the stress and fighting and upheaval? Would you go back and just take the tip if you could?" Thomas thought about this carefully. "No, because if I had taken that money, I would have compromised something fundamental in myself. I would have accepted that everything has a price, including my principles, and that would have changed who I am. Everything that happened after, as difficult as it was, came from staying true to myself. I can't regret that. Even when it nearly cost you everything. Even then. Because I learned something important. I learned that standing up for what's right isn't just about grand gestures or obvious battles. Sometimes it's about small moments, small choices. Refusing a tip, helping someone who can't pay, teaching a young boy. These things matter. They add up. They create a life that means something." Pavel nodded slowly. "You're a wiser man than I am. I would have taken the money and avoided all the trouble." "Maybe," Thomas said with a smile. "But you also stood by me through everything. You helped me when I needed it most. You risked your own comfort to support your friend. That's its own kind of wisdom, its own kind of courage." They sat together as darkness fell over Lipova, two old friends who had weathered storms and come through stronger. In the distance, lights began to flicker on in homes and businesses. People were finishing their day, gathering with family, living their simple lives. It was ordinary and beautiful, this everyday existence that Thomas had fought so hard to preserve. Inside his workshop, the tools waited for tomorrow's work. The phone would ring with customers needing help. Martin would stop by after school to learn more about engines and life. The seasons would change and time would pass, and the work would continue. This was the victory, not the settlement or the legal triumph, but this continuity of purpose and meaning. Thomas thought about Helena and how she would have understood all of this instinctively. She had always known that true wealth was measured in relationships and integrity, in the ability to sleep peacefully at night, knowing you had lived according to your values. He had lost her so many years ago, but in some way she had never left. She lived on in the choices he made, in the man he had become, in the love he still carried for her memory. And now, through Elena, he had recovered a piece of that past while building something new. Life had brought him full circle in unexpected ways. As he locked up the workshop and headed home that night, Thomas felt a contentment that went deeper than happiness. He had faced a great challenge and emerged with his soul intact. He had stood up to power without becoming corrupted by it. He had won without losing himself in the process. That was enough. That was everything. The story could have ended differently. Victor Stern could have destroyed him completely. The legal system could have failed. Public opinion could have turned against him. Any number of things could have gone wrong. But they hadn't, and Thomas chose to see that as evidence that the world, for all its flaws and injustices, still had room for goodness to prevail. Sometimes when you stood firm in what was right, when you refused to compromise your principles for convenience or profit, life had a way of supporting that stand. Not always, but often enough to restore faith in humanity. In the end, this was not really a story about a mechanic and a millionaire. It was a story about what we value and how we choose to live. It was about the quiet courage of ordinary people who do the right thing even when it costs them. It was about the power of integrity in a world that often seems to reward the opposite. And it was about the truth that some things cannot be bought or taken away, that the wealth we carry in our hearts and characters is the only wealth that truly matters. Thomas Novak understood this in a way that Victor Stern never had, and perhaps never would. And that understanding, more than any legal victory or financial settlement, was what made him truly rich.